what I would like to do in the time I have is to somehow divide my presentation into three parts. The first part would be a very brief introduction to the field of futures thinking. Since I'm going to speak about the future, I would like you to know that I'm not going to, speak from my guts, but from a very systematic way of analyzing trends. Then I'm going to show you the Jewish context of the 21st century. And then I'm going to a little bit explain the challenges that are ahead of the Jews worldwide, and also very specifically the community that resides in Israel. So let's start. By the way, please, if you have any questions, just write them down on the chat so that at the end I would be able to, to address some of them at least. So what are future studies? The term is really in plural, since there is no one single future. There are actually infinite futures, and what we are trying to do is to analyze the possibilities that might occur in the future, and we give those possibilities a figure that says how sure we are that those possibilities are going to be realized at the end. That's what we call in statistics reliability. So we tend to analyze different kinds of futures, from probable futures to wildcard futures that seems very unusual or very logical that they will happen at the end, and we tend to give it what we call the statistical reliability I just mentioned. How do we do it? Well, most importantly to understand is that the field is a branch of a different discipline in academia, which is called systems thinking. We are actually systems researchers. We are trying to understand how systems are evolving. And by systems, we mean anything that can be defined as a system, from ecological systems to behavioral systems, and of course, geopolitical systems, etc., etc. And we are trying to figure out how those systems are evolving with a lot of methodologies. You have here just, a few that probably some of them are familiar to you. The idea is that all those methodologies are based upon one single and crucial assumption, which is that there is logic how systems are evolving. Most of us nowadays are, walking with a kind of a belief that everything is chaotic. From our point of view, nothing is chaotic. There is logic. Even chaos is not chaos. Even chaos is a higher level of organization of a system. Just for this very simple sentence, somebody received the Nobel Prize in the 80s. His name was Prigozhin. So that's what we are trying to do. I think that's enough for a very brief introduction to the field. What I'm going to try and do in the time I have is to analyze some very interesting Israeli and world Jewish trends, which are very different than what we call now global trends. Not just the Jewish and Israeli trends are different, they are also opposite to what we're going to experience worldwide. And it's very important to put it in mind, since, we tend to compare ourselves to a lot of other trends that are happening worldwide. And it's very important to be aware that it's not exactly the same, and our version of our megatrends that are going to shape Jewish history in the 21st century is different. And if it's different, then it's going to have probably a lot of nuances that we better be aware of. So I'm going to start with a very important global trend that is going to shape humanity in the 21st century. And then I'm going to zoom in to the Jewish people and to the Israeli Israelis very specifically. Write it down. This is what we call the global demographic winter. Okay, so let me give you a sense of what I'm speaking about, but just put it in mind, it's going to shape the lives of a lot of people during the 21st century. Let's take a very, large perspective from a bird's eye of, millennia. About 12,000 years ago, from, of course, a scientific point of view, there were, as far as we know, there were about 10,000, there were about 1 million people, at best 5 million people on Earth. By people, I mean these Homo sapiens. Okay, about 60,000 years ago, we know that this species almost was extinct. There were only about 10,000 people like you and me on this planet, and then we somehow regained the population, and we started developing in a manner that is really very interesting. Since during millennia, we barely accumulated more and more population worldwide. And time after time, there were, as you know, pandemics, and we knew that this pandemic will come. Where we know that, by the way, that there are more pandemics in the way. So doesn't matter. Humanity was able to recover time after time until about 2,000 years ago. Humanity reached the 250 million mark. When we reached that number, something unusual happened. We started growing in what we call a very unusual curve. Okay, it took humanity about 800 years until we quadrupled that number to 1 billion. But when we reached the 1 billion mark, take a look of what happened. It took humanity, as you see, only about 130 years to double that number. Okay, we reached the 2 billion mark, and then it took only 30 years to add another billion, and then only 15 years, another billion. And you see that something really unusual happened in the last century. And everything that has happened during this last century was based upon what we call this very interesting and profound driving force. Okay, remember another term, the driving force of a lot of things that are happening, from world wars to technologies to the way we are communicating now from far. Everything was based upon this amazing growth of humanity. If there were not so many people on Earth, a lot of things would not develop, as you all know, politically, and of course economically and technologically, etc., etc. And as far as we understand, humanity have reached about 7.8 billion people about a year ago. Probably we are now around 8 billion people, even though most of the time we tend to add another 200 million people at least that are not accounted somehow in every country. Every country has a group of people that nobody knows that they exist in their country. So we are about 8 billion people right now. What is really amazing is that in the next 30 years, humanity probably is going to reach to take another step and reach almost 10 billion people. There are some differences between some studies, but it might go from 9.23 to 9.7, and maybe even 10 billion people. It depends what will happen in the next 30 years, but we are speaking about 9 to 10 billion people. But the most important thing what most of the people really don't know is that by the end of the 21st century, humanity is going to start shrinking. And at best, humanity might reach 11 billion, but there are a lot of studies that are pointing to the number of 6 or 7 billion people. If this is what is going to happen in the 21st century, then everything we know is going to be very different. How different? This is the domain of a lot of studies that are running now all over the world, trying to understand how it's going to affect politics, values, family structures, geopolitical issues. Everything actually is embedded in those figures, as you see now. The amazing thing is that in the last 250 years, humanity is going to go from 1 billion people to about 10 billion people, and then it will start declining, which is something that we have never seen in humanity. We've seen that those kind of phenomena in different places worldwide, but not as huge as we are going probably to experience. So this is, a very large view of the 21st century. There are a lot of reasons why this trend is going to mature. I'm going just to share with you some of the reasons. We have lists of reasons, but let me just cover one or two reasons. Take, for example, this phenomena, which is really something that we are really still don't understand exactly what drives it completely. As far as we know, for millennia, there were more females than males. And what we've seen in the last couple decades is that the ratio between genders is totally reversed. And we're speaking now that at the age of, from birth to about 19 years old, there are 17 more males than females at that age group, which means 17% of humanity doesn't have a biological horizons. Of course, there will be some differences here and there, but this is huge. That energy is going to dissipate in ways that we are trying to understand, from criminal activities to wars, etc., because as those males most of the time are coming from lower socioeconomic cohorts and groups, and they are very much driven to be very aggressive, etc. Okay, take for example, that was the average worldwide. Of course, every country is going to be different. In Israel, for example, there will be it's already that these are the numbers nowadays. There are already 5% more males than females. How is it going to affect family structures? How is it going to affect, for example, future maladies? We know that there are differences between males and females in different kinds of diseases, for example, etc. Take, for example, in the region of the Middle East, this is something unusual. They have never experienced that there are more males than females. Most of the time, they had much more females than males, and that's why probably they have also developed that custom to have more than one spouse. You don't have to. You cannot leave girls by themselves. So, how is it going to affect the values of those countries, etc.? To take, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there are already 20 more males than females in that age group. How is it going to affect relationships between sects, between nations? Because everybody would like to take from the pool of females as much as possible, in order, of course, to sustain the development of their countries, to sustain the evolution of their kinship, etc. There are some countries that are already in trying to understand how to react to those what we call megatrends. I'll just give you one example. Saudi Arabia, one of the reasons they are investing billions of dollars on those kinds of religious schools, if you wish, is because more than 20% of those kids will not be able to have a mate in their life cycle. That's a frightening energy that the rulers of those nations are so afraid, and so they are pouring billions of dollars into those institutes in order to somehow manage that energy. Of course, the outcome of those kind of institutes is fundamentalism, and part of fundamentalism is what we call nowadays global and worldwide terrorism. So this is just to give you an example how we analyze things. Let me go to a very large view of the Jewish people during the millennia. As far as we know, again, from a scientific point of view, I'm stressing that that word. Okay, about 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago was exactly the time of King David in Jerusalem. As far as we know from a scientific point of view, there were about 300,000 people at that time. We were called at that time Hebrews. Okay, we started being named Jews only 500 years ago, after the destruction of the first temple, in which the majority of the remaining Jews were from descendants of the Judea tribe, and so we started being called Jews, generally speaking. Even though not only Judean descendants remained, there were some of them from Simon, from Benjamin. There was a collection of tribes that actually remained and went to Babylon, and they started being named Jews. Let's go forward in time about 700 years ago, a very important time in Jewish history, which is called the Golden Era in Spain. As far as we know, there were about 1 million Jews. Out of those 1 million Jews, about 70% resided in Spain. That's an amazing, again, time in history in which we thrived because of the concentration of a lot of people at that time in Spain. Of course, 200 years after that, the Spanish expulsion, and out of those 700,000 people, about 300,000 people were expelled, and about 400,000 people just assimilated within Spain and Portugal. And those that were expelled actually spread in the Middle East, in East Europe, in Turkey and Morocco and Tunisia, etc. And that was a phenomena that somehow was not embedded in our DNA somehow, because if you think about that phenomena of expulsion, that something like half of the Jews of Spain were expelled, it's more than even a Holocaust that we are speaking about in the 20th century, even though it's not exactly the Holocaust, because they didn't die, they just were assimilated, but still it's a trauma that was supposed to make a lot of difference in Jewish history, and it did not. And there are a lot of studies trying to understand exactly why, but it doesn't matter. What really happens is that in a matter of another 300 years, Judaism worldwide reaches the 3 million mark. But after that, something unusual happens. In a matter of just about 140 years, humanity goes from 1 billion people to 3 billion people, but the Jews go from 3 million people to about 18 million people, which is an amazing phenomenon. There are a lot of reasons for it. Of course, from emancipation to the phenomena of being in ghettos that Jews were concentrated in, and they were a little bit more hygienic in their daily life than the surrounding. And this is a phenomena that probably one of the outcomes of that phenomena is the fear that the Jews have generated in their communities because of the growth, an amazing pace of growth that happened in a very short of time. And one of the outcomes of one of the reactions to that growth was, of course, anti-Semitism, and at the end, of course, also the Holocaust. If we are really to understand what happened in World Jewry, the numbers are a little bit different in different places. We are speaking that at the moment we are something like about 15 million Jews worldwide, which means that we have just started recovering from the Holocaust. Because, from 18 million Jews, we remained 12 million Jews. By the way, before World War II, there were 18 million Jews, but 12 million were in Europe. Okay, now we have just started recovering from that 12 million that was with us for many decades after World War II. And if we really want to understand what really drives the Jewish people, and most importantly, the Israelis nowadays, please remember the next two figures. The first is how many Jews would have been worldwide if the Holocaust would not have happened, and of course, an Israel would have been established. So it's not an easy thing to do ifs in history, but there are some studies that are trying to really understand the context of Israel in the 21st century based upon if something didn't happen in history. And two scholars are doing those kind of studies. One is Professor De La Pergola from University, and the other one is Professor Anita Shapira from Tel Aviv University. And they basically agree that if there was no Holocaust and there was a Jewish state, we would have been now 34 million people, which means a double of what we are at the moment. And probably everything that we have known in the last 50, 70 years would have been very different in terms of politics, in terms of the dominance of Jewish groups all over the world, and of course in Europe, political issues, intellectual creativity, etc., etc. This is very important if you really want to understand the fear that is driving the Jewish people at the beginning of the 21st century. Remember the next figure. Okay, if there was a Holocaust and there was no Jewish state, they are speaking that we would have been now barely 7 million people worldwide, which means half of what we are at the moment. That means that Israel was a savior in Jewish history by all means. Okay, and the reason is because, of course, fertility rate of the Israelis, because of the concentration of communities coming together, etc., etc. This is a very important driving force that is going to have is already having an effect on Jews all over the world, but it's going to affect, of course, Jews that are in Israel. Okay, let's go to recent numbers. Now we are about, let's say, 15 million Jews worldwide. And for the first time in Jewish history, really, after 2,600 years from the destruction of the first temple, we are the largest Jewish community that resides now in Israel. Okay, we are about 7 million Jews now in Israel, about 9.5 almost citizens in Israel. And this is something that, as far as we know, even during the biblical times, okay, during the first temple, there were a lot of Jews that were scattered in the Middle East. There were a lot of people in Egypt. There were a lot of people in Mesopotamia. There were a lot of people in different places, even in Europe. We know that nowadays. Okay. By the way, there were about 1 million people, 1 million Jews in Egypt. Not only that later on during the Second Temple era, the Jews in Egypt even established a temple, a replica of the temple from Jerusalem in Egypt. So it's something really unusual that after at least 2,600 years, the largest Jewish community resides in Israel. And it's going to shape everything in the future because it's a landmark that we are trying really to understand. And it's a landmark, it's a threshold that it's going to have an effect on Jewish history, on the Jewish narrative, the religious narrative. Everything is going to be different in half a century from now, of course, for a century from now. Okay, if you want to see how Jews are scattered still at the moment in worldwide. In the US, the largest Jewish community before World War II was in Poland, and then it moved to the US. For many, many years, it was 6 million Jews. Now, at best, there are about 5.7 million Jews in the US, and in Israel, it's already 7 million Jews. And you see France still for 500,000, Canada about 400,000 million. If you want to know how many Jews in Ukraine, we were in Ukraine just a month ago. There were about 50,000 Jews in Ukraine. And a lot of people are speaking about 200,000 people, but that's not the right thing. Okay, let's see the Israeli population by 2050 and world Jewish population by 2050. Again, as far as we know, most of the studies are speaking that it will take about a century for world Jewry to recover from the Holocaust, which is really not a lot. It's nothing. In history, a century, it's nothing. Of course, in our personal life cycle, it's a lot, but in history, it's nothing. And the idea is that by 2050, the Jewish history is going to be exactly reversed, which means before World War II, there were 18 million Jews worldwide. Out of those 18 million, about 12 million Jews were in Europe. A century later, there will be 12 million Jews in Israel and another 6 million worldwide, which is something unusual, okay, in a matter of one century. Of course, in Israel, we are going to experience almost a doubling of its population in a matter just in the next 30 years, which is a huge challenge that is going to be on the shoulders of our offsprings, because they will need to plan and build and establish institutes that will manage not just 9 million people, but about 17 million people. This is, of course, something that we are speaking about a lot. It has a lot of effects on the prices of as you know, of real estate, but a lot of other things. Let me take you now, 80 years ahead, which is the time that you are all going to be active in your communities and in Israel, of course. Again, there are some studies that are trying to figure out the numbers. The reliability of the numbers you're going to see is about 80%, which is a lot by all means. Things might be different a little bit, but 80% reliability that something is such as this is going to happen, it's really a lot. So we are speaking, and we are. This is a figure that the UN is calculating with a lot of new statistical models. They are speaking that by the end of the 21st century, there will be about 24 million Israeli citizens in Israel. out of those 24 million citizens, 20 million Jews and 4 million minorities. Now, if this is what's going to happen, that means that never in history there were so many people, first of all, on that piece of land, and of course, never so many Jews in that piece of land, which means we are speaking about the century of world Jewry in history. This is going to be marked as something unusual in our history, and it's going to change everything we know about nowadays as Jewish. Okay, we are moving to another era in history, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the characteristic of that era, because it's really very interesting. It's very mind-boggling, at least to a futurist that is trying to understand how things are evolving. Now, this is what the UN is speaking about. I know that in Israel, we've done a scenario that speaks that already by 2065, we're going to reach 24 million people, which is an amazing challenge, because how do you, if you see the numbers all over the world is shrinking, and in Israel, they are really growing up. And so how do you build 2 more countries in that piece of land in a matter of another 80 years? It took us about 80 years to build one country. Now, in 80 years, we need to add 2 more countries to that piece of land, and that outcome needs to be much more nicer, much more aesthetic, much more organized, much more everything, much more. Otherwise, people will not stay. Okay, and this is, I believe, the most challenging issue of world Jewry. How not just to establish a new nation, but how to develop that nation to be at least a regional superpower that is very much organized and well managed, and of course everything else. All right, let's discuss some of the challenges that are going to be driven by this driving force, which is, as you see, very opposed to what the world is going to experience. Okay. Now, I've written a book exactly about this issue. It was published about 6 months ago, a little bit more. The book is also in English, so if you wish to read it, please just send me an email and I'll give you a link or whatever, as much as I can. It's in Hebrew also, so I would discuss here with you a few points. But if you really want to enlarge the scope of the outcome of those mega trends on the future of Jewish history, please welcome to read, and I welcome your comments and your questions as much as I can. So let me take a few challenges and describe what is probably going to be ahead of us, and what are the dilemmas, what are the challenges that Jewish leaders in Israel and worldwide will have to address and come up with the ideas and come up with the solutions. Okay, I would like to take an analogy with which I will describe one of the most important challenges that is ahead of us. Okay, you are all familiar with the analogy of Marco Polo, when the Mongolian Caesar asked Marco Polo, "Where are you from?" Marco Polo starts speaking about, telling about a city called Octavia that is, up in the skies, and what the citizens of that city is constantly doing is just managing, that city so that it will not fall down and will crash and kill everybody that is in that city. Of course, it's a very interesting analogy of human lives. We are constantly taking care of our infrastructures, of our physiological aspect, etc., so that will not diminish and disappear. And I would take that analogy into what we call the psyche of the Jewish people. We are, by the way, if you are from Spain, you probably are aware of that there is a city like that, up in mountains. You see that it's really nice to even to go and travel and see that phenomena. So Octavia, by at least according to Marco Polo, was based on a web, a spider web that the citizens are constantly taking care of, so that web will not break and the city will collapse. Now, if I'm to take that analogy to the Jewish people, I would say the following: there were until now about 4 types of ropes that were entangled together, and the Jewish people for at least the last 2 millennia were on that rope. Okay, there were people that decided that they don't want anymore to be part of the Jewish people, and they jumped from that rope. Okay, in the last 200 years, that rope that was built from 4 different ropes somehow started to unwind. And what we are speaking about today is that there are 4 different ropes on which different groups in the Jewish people are standing. Okay, the issue is that each group believes very much by all their hearts that the other groups that are standing on the other different ropes will not survive. Only those who remain in their specific kind of rope will survive the history of the Jewish people. So the first rope is what we call the Halachic Mindset. That says that, Judaism is basically a group of people that have a religion, and if you are not religious, then your probability to survive history as a part of the Jewish people will diminish greatly. Okay, this is a very dominant view, even though statistically there are only a minority of Jews that really are walking daily with that psychological understanding. Okay, that's the first one. The other rope, if you wish, emphasize that Judaism is, an ethnicity group, and there is such a thing as a Jewish society. Okay, so it's not a religious society; it's a kind of an ethnic group. Okay, and those that will remain on the rope that says that only halacha will be our ability, only with halacha will be able to sustain the hardship of history, probably are going to bring down Judaism if they will remain standing on that rope only. The third group says, well, we are like a lot of other groups worldwide, that their language is the dominant part of their identity. Like there are, for example, Anglo-Saxons and Francophones, etc. The Jewish people, actually, it's a Hebraic society. We know that A language is not just, a simple way to communicate with each other, but a form of thinking, a different kind of understanding, perceiving the world, a different kind of expressing and be creative. We know that the language is much more than most of us really think. So that third group says we are a Hebraic society. Okay, and you can see that a lot of groups all over the world are using those terms. Okay, and of course there is a fourth group in World Jewry nowadays that says, well, we are just like any other group that has now a nation, and we are an Israeli society. We are not Jews, we are Israelis. Okay, and it's like being a French, a Christian French, a Muslim French, a Jew French. We are also, you can be a Muslim Israeli, you can be a Christian Israeli, you can be a Jew Israeli. We are basically a group of people that are forming a nation. Okay, these are the four groups. 200 years ago, until 200 years ago, those four groups or four mindsets, if you wish, were entangled together and formed a very solid and large rope on which we were able to stand for millennia. And it turned to be something that was sustainable, because here you and me are still somehow around. In the last 200 years, those four groups, four mindsets started unwinding, and now we have definitely four different ropes, and each one of us needs to decide where to stand. Okay, sometimes we even stand on two ropes, one here and one there, one time here, one time there, but most of us are basically geared towards one or two at best ropes. And that brings a lot of differences among different groups in the Jewish world. Okay, if you wish to understand this theory, Abuluf Ariel has done his PhD exactly on it. And what he did is he analyzed the discourse of Zionism in the last 100 years. And what he found is that the discourse of the Zionist intellectuals was exactly around those four aspects of Judaism. And the debates were, what is exactly the hierarchy that Israel needs to form in order to really establish a very sustainable Jewish community. And what he found is that the debates still remain to this day, and there is no decision which one is the first and the second and the third and the fourth. And it's very interesting to read what he has read, because you see that everything that is going on even nowadays, all the debates in the Israeli Knesset, the debates between the sect, the Jewish sect, the Jewish denominations, everything is based upon where do you put your feet in defining who you are exactly. Okay, actually, there is a very interesting study that was published a few years ago, and I would really recommend to read it. It's also in English. That without being aware of this theory, found that the Israelis in Israel, at least, are exactly divided in those four groups. And what he found is what Fox and Rosner have found is something really interesting, because up to now we thought that the Israelis in Israel, the Jews in Israel, are somehow divided as follows. About 20%, let's say, Orthodox, those that are basing all their, their mindset upon the halachic rope. There were about 30% that didn't want to see any Jewish or Judaic religious aspect to the nation of Israel, and the others, they were very hard to define. That's for decades. Now they have found something really unusual. They found that there are about 17% of Jews in Israel that are observing Jewish practices, and their identity is based mostly on the Jewish religion, okay, which is a little bit, as we thought, but a little bit less than a lot of people think. A lot of people think that in Israel there are about 20 to 30% that are religious, but actually this study didn't find that as accurate. What they have found is that in the other part of the spectrum, something unusual happened. Those 30% that used to be, non-religious, didn't, practice Passover, they didn't practice Yom Kippur, etc. That 30% now is divided into two groups. The first group, they call them the Universalists, about 13%. Okay, they don't want to see anything Jewish in Israel. Okay, they would like to see the state of Israel as any other country, that without any mark of religion. Okay, and of course, the other part of those 30% are, they're emphasizing the nationality, but they give up totally Jewish practice. The 13%, they also give up the nationality of Israelis. They are kind of, the citizens of the world. The most interesting thing that Fox and Rosner have found is that there is a large group of Israelis, about 55%, that is emerging lately, in which they would like to see a kind of symbiosis between nationality and religiosity. So that's, a lot of people might call them Masorti, but it's a different kind of Masorti than we used to think before that. They really want to see marriages based upon religious practices. They would like to see in the public aspect of the nation, Shabbat, and they would like to see holidays. They would like to see a Jewish state, not a state for Jews. Okay, the problem is that this group is not exactly very well defined. That group doesn't have still, intellectuals that are coming up with a very clear and cohesive ideas that might, bring a lot of people under the umbrella of those ideas. Politically, there are a few people now in Israel that claim to represent that group, but they are not coming with a very cohesive ideology for that group. And according to Rosner and Fox, this group is going to be the one that is going to be dominant the more we progress into the 21st century. Now, a different study that was done by the Pew Research Center in the US, also at that same time, came up with a very interesting result regarding how the Jews in the United States are divided. I believe you are all familiar already with that study. Now, they came up with a very kind of novel methodology to analyze religiosity within the American different kinds of religions. Okay, they divided religiosity into 7 stages or 7 aspects, from the most religious people to the non-religious people, and there are actually those 7 stages or phases or levels, if you wish, are organized into 3 groups. So when they analyzed the different religions in the US, they found, the S curve, as we all know. They found that in the outskirt of the S, very few people, and most of the people are concentrated on the middle of that S curve. When they analyzed the Jews in the US, they found something very different. What they found is, again, about 17% highly religious, okay? And by religious, I mean not Orthodox, okay? You can be a Reform and very religious. You can be a conservative and very religious, all right? And that's 17% of a religious mindset, okay? Which will go every Shabbat to synagogue, and they will send their kids to religious schools, etc., etc. The middle of that curve or methodology, or if you wish, levels of religiosity, is dissected into very small groups. But there's very interesting result that they realized, they came up with, is that 42% of the American Jewry is actually against the Jewish religion. And if not against, they would like to be really very separated from any kind of a religious institute, which really raises a lot of question marks about the future of the relationships between World Jewry, or the American Jewry at least, and the Israeli Jewry. And a lot of differences, a lot of debates, a lot of clashes are actually based upon this phenomena that the Pew Research has found. And that explains a lot of things. Okay, now let's see what is the challenge, the first challenge that World Jewry needs to address in order somehow to recover from the 20th century totally, and continue progressing and of course developing the 21st century. So the first challenge is, can we strengthen back the ties between those 4 ropes so that it will hold World Jewry in the 21st century? Okay, personally, I believe that those ropes are already so separated. There is no way to bring them back together and tie them together and entangle them together. Each one is so different, and believes that his rope is the most sustainable rope that will hold World Jewry in the 21st century, and all other ropes will bring a disaster to those that will stand upon them. So I believe that we need to reinvent a new kind of ties for the 21st century and beyond, because we have actually marked, we have we have passed a threshold, as I have mentioned before, in which, that's it, the majority of Jews by 2050, about 70% of world Jewry will reside in Israel. And by the end of the 21st century, there will be about 80 and maybe even 85% of world Jewry will reside in Israel. So we are speaking about a very different entity. And that entity needs to revisit its very basic tenets, its very basic narratives. And what really makes a difference between what we used to see and what we're going to see is that for the first time, a group, the largest group of people, not only reside in Israel, but they are sovereign in their state, which is something that didn't happen for 2,600 years. Even during the second temple era, the Jews were not sovereign as we would like to think. The sovereignty was very, very, in very small epochs. Most of the time, we're part of a large and great power that took over, sometime politically and sometime even militarily, that piece of land. So we are speaking about a very different era, and we need to imagine, and we need to generate a new idea that will bring together those groups. It's a great challenge. The greatest challenge of Judaism in the last 120 years was Zionism. It was not a new idea, but the idea was, okay, let's stop praying and believing that somebody somewhere somehow will come and will take us immediately to Israel and will be resurrected. Zionism said, no, let's take a new modern tool of politics, of geopolitics, okay, which is called actually global geopolitical issues or diplomacy, global diplomacy. Let's take that tool and work to establish a homeland in which at least the past destiny will not, repeat itself again and again. That was an amazing challenge. Most of the Jews worldwide didn't believe they'll be able to succeed in that challenge. And here we are, 120 years after the first Zionist Congress. The largest Jewish community resides in Israel. In manners, in a very advanced economy, a very advanced, security forces. It was not an easy thing to achieve. It still needs a lot of work to be somehow complete. But nobody could have even imagined that in a matter of 80 years almost, we'll be able to do it. So we need to come up with a new idea, a cohesive idea. I call it a raison d'être, okay? We need to not base our raison d'être upon what we used to be in the past. We need something that is what we call a covenant of future destiny. Now, a lot of nations have done the same process, okay? And if I am to analyze the Jewish people of the last century, I would say the following, okay? The Jewish people have established a state upon what we call a covenant of faith. The idea was to bring a lot of groups, a lot of sects, a lot of denominations together to accept, to work on the aim so that the past will not repeat itself time after time in vicious cycles. Okay? That was what organized Zionism in the last century also. Okay? That's not enough. And it's not enough because what you find in history, different groups have already done the same process. What you find is that after 3, at best 4 generations, that, that accord among those groups dissipates. It's not a permanent glue that holds those groups for, forever. It tends to dissipate. In order to continue developing a nation, that group that is in that nation needs to come up with an idea that will sustain that group in the future, an aim to strive for, okay, a purpose, or what we call a raison d'être. Why do we need a Jewish state in the 21st century? Of course, we are still, helping people that are being, that are being cruelly treated. But it's, in a matter of 20, 30 years, that'll be it. Most of the Jews will be in Israel. And we will not have to take care of, large groups of Jews that are in Ukraine that will be in different places to save them in times of cruelty. So we need an idea, a new idea that takes from the past, that takes from tradition, that takes from a new understanding of the of humanity in the 21st century, that needs to take into account new sciences. We need to develop a new idea why we need to be in a place like Israel in the 21st century and beyond. Now, a lot of nations have done it already. What we have found is that after 4 generations, that covenant of destiny of past destiny is dissipating. And in the process of regenerating a new idea, there's always a civil war. Okay, so after that civil war, people are suddenly, having an enlightenment, a new idea around which all the groups are gathering, and based on that idea, they establish new institutes, new narratives, and they will even conduct wars with others based on that idea. For example, the U.S. have, after a cruel civil war, they came up with the idea of personal freedom, which has great advantages in the last couple hundred years. And we see it nowadays in different forms. French also went through the same process. Okay, and they came up after a very cruel civil war. They came out with 3 words. What's interesting is that idea needs to be defined in 2 or 3 words only. And behind those 2-3 words, there is a large and very profound philosophy that makes it very unique to strive for. So France came with liberté, égalité, fraternité. Now, even after World War II, the European community and the nations were so shocked from the cruelty they have experienced. They said, that's it. Let's organize ourselves around one idea and form a larger national identity and entity. And the EU also have decided just a few years ago to organize themselves around a new idea. They are now calling it unity in diversity. But still, these are just examples how entities are organizing themselves after a certain point in which the past is not holding anymore the groups that have formed during the first stage of the establishment of a national entity. So we need also a new covenant that will bring together the parties within the Jewish people and start working together to establish and realize that idea in different kinds of relationships and forms and institute, etc., etc. Okay, I believe that this is the most important challenge, or if you wish, a mission that the different denominations worldwide of Jews, the different institutes, the different groups can take upon themselves to engage in formulating a new, relevant, durable, unique definition of what is it exactly a Jewish state or a Jewish culture. Okay, and maybe it will hold more than 2 centuries and 3 centuries, and it will be a platform on which Jews and Israelis will work together in order to achieve higher levels of developments of our culture, of our narrative, etc. I believe that if we will, it's like we've done it with the Zionist movement. We brought a lot of parties to organized institutes to draft specific missions, and together we have been able to establish an amazing place that is so vibrant and so unusual, and with a lot of challenges. Still, it's not done. It's all those processes in history are not a matter of a century. Most of the time, it takes much more than a couple centuries. But if we understand it, we are able to draft a new mission for our world organizations, the different kinds of organizations and different kinds of denominations. Now, I was trying very hard for many years to try if I can suggest a new idea around which we can reorganize ourselves as a national entity, as a new, even a religious narrative. Okay, I came out with, let's say, a new variation of the personal freedom that was able to unleash amazing creativity in the last couple hundred years. Okay, I'm coming with an idea that says, okay, we have established the personal freedom mindset within people, but that freedom mindset has a lot of holes within it. Okay, and it's already atomizing democracies worldwide. Everybody thinks he's the person, he's the center, he's the one that everybody needs to worship. Okay, now I'm taking that idea of freedom of masses also from Jewish tradition. Okay, so it's not a contradictory to the idea of personal freedom, but it's more of a next level, if you wish, of the idea of democracy that we can, if we will be able to clearly fine-tune, it can be also a new vision for other countries, not just for us. Okay, because the freedom of the personal individual has a lot of negative aspects that we are constantly seeing the more we progress in time. Okay, the idea of a covenant that will be able to bring into the 4th stage not the personal freedom, but the masses of freedom, is also based upon a lot of new ideas in technologies, in sciences, in philosophies. I was able to bring together a large body of resources and intellectual ideas, and somehow brought it in under the phrase of masses of freedom. I would really urge you to go in a little bit more enlarge and read about it in my book. But the basic idea is that we cannot anymore put the individual in the center, but the groups in the center, and the relationships between those groups are much more important than the status of the individual. Now, it sounds for some a little bit fuzzy, but I believe that this is just a suggestion to the kind of ideas we need to develop. In my book, I'm also developing a formula how we can bring to the table different ideas in order to clarify what's really best for us and decide upon those a new idea. That's one issue. The other challenge, which is very important also, is who's going to lead the Jewish people towards achieving the first challenge. Okay, this is something that concerns your very specific group here. And are we able to say something? What is the profile of the leader that we need to develop that will be able to take upon himself or herself that challenge in order to advance Jewish history to its next phase in time. Now, in order to answer that question, as a futurist, I said, let me see if I can find a pattern in Jewish history that depicts how leaders were different in different epoch. Okay, so first of all, I came up with a very nice idea that up to now there were about 4 phases in Jewish history. Okay, each phase, each epoch was totally different than the previous one. It had a different leadership. Their leadership came from a different kind of authority. Each epoch used to have a different narrative, a different kind of a religion. Now, we think that the Jewish religion was the same from the beginning. Well, if you really go deep inside understanding how things has evolved in Judaism, you'll see that there were different epochs with different ideas, with different even aims and even kind of religiosity. Okay, the most known thing is that before the destruction of the first temple, Judaism used to go after the father. After the destruction of the first temple, Ezra and Nehemiah actually changed it. And from then on, Jewish halacha goes after the mother, not after the father. So that was a huge transformation. And these are the kinds that transformations Judaism needs to continue doing in order to continue, of course, its path, a journey in history. So what I found is there were 4 epochs. The first one is what we call the Forefathers Epoch, and Forefathers, it was in the from the 15th and 16th century BCE up to the time of the kings. The second epoch were the epoch of the kings. From King Saul and David to the destruction of the first temple, another 500 years almost. And then came the third epoch, in which the leaders were the priests, and they were the leaders during the whole time of the Second Temple until it was destroyed in 70 CE. Okay, and the fourth epoch was from then on the epoch of the rabbis. Okay, and Judaism, as we know it nowadays, was drafted and was developed and was established during the rabbinical epoch. Okay, that's the largest, that's the longest epoch in Jewish history up to now. The first three epochs are very interesting. What I found is that each epoch probably took about 500 years, plus minus. What I found is that at the last, it also always started with a very interesting vision. Okay, for example, the first epoch started with a vision of a federation of tribes, but in a matter of a few centuries, that vision collapsed, and the last 2 centuries of each epoch was characterized by clashes between the groups that used to be at that time in history. And those clashes, you know, for example, in the King's era, in a matter of the last 200 years of those 500 years were marked by 7 civil wars between the sects in Israel at that time. And of course, it started with the division between the Judea kingdom and the Israeli kingdom. And the 7 very cruel civil wars. At the end, of course, it was a disaster, and even the Judean part was destroyed, and the Babylonians took the remaining people to exile. But that was the same thing with the third epoch. Okay, you can see it in history that, you know, even siblings killed each other. Kings were murdered time after time. Everybody wanted to be the leader. And at the end, of course, you know, just small sects, so small groups that were fighting each other. Who's going to lead the fight against the Romans? And they brought the destruction of the Second Temple, in which almost the Jewish people was eliminated in history. Only 3,000 people remained in Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple. Of course, there was another attempt to go after the Romans, but it was a disaster in Jewish history. And all of you know what happened with the what's his name? I forgot right now. Anyway, so you all know what happened. And then we started the rabbinical era. The religion as we know it, Judaism as we know it, was drafted after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud was drafted and was written, in the 3rd century, in the 4th century. And we are all the outcome of that amazing, achievement in history. But we are probably at the end of that epoch. Since, as I have mentioned, for the first time, we are gathering back in a certain place with a sovereignty, and our mindset is very different. And we're going to shape Jewish history in a very different way. Who's going to lead? again, what I found is something interesting. I found that on each epoch, there were two elite groups that competed who's to lead. Okay, what I found is that the elite group that used to be the leaders most of the time didn't succeed to lead and brought the destruction of that era. When the new era came about, the elites that were that were pushed aside in the previous era took over the leadership with a new vision, and they believe that they will be doing it in much better than the previous group of elites. Okay, and that's the same thing what happened with the priests. The kings said, well, we will be doing it much better than the tribes leaders. And the priest then said, we will be doing it much better than the kings. Okay. And the rabbi said, what really characterizes all those leaders is that it's a kinship leadership. Leadership is going from father to son. And the rabbi said, no, let's form a new kind of leadership. If you wish, a meritocratic kind of leadership. If you are a learned person, if you are an intellectual, and the community accepts you as the leader, then you're the leader. You're not. The leadership doesn't go from father to son anymore. Of course, there were some sects in the last 300 years that, again, started that pattern, and for example, in some rabbinical groups, the leadership of being a rabbi passed from father to son, and then it was not exactly always the best thing to have. Okay. By the way, for example, the Chabadnikim didn't pass on from father to son. And they passed the leadership to somebody that was really unusual as a leader, and he did what he did. We all see how the Chabad movement has succeeded. So the question is, who was the elite or the mindset? Let's not call them the elites. The mindset that was pushed aside during the rabbinical era. If we are to pinpoint who might be those people that didn't bring their voice into the forefront of the table and be part of generating ideas, if we will be able to define that group, then I might, point to who might be the leaders that will be able to take the challenges of the 21st century and succeed in generating new ideas that will bring together the parties that holds the World Jewry. I believe that, and in my book I really go and describe them at length. I believe that the new elite is the feminine mindset that was not part of the Jewish narrative in the last 2,000 years. It was a little bit part during the first and second era by some prophets that were females, but then they almost disappeared from the elite thinkers of in Jewish history. And I believe that it's also part of something that is happening worldwide. It's not just something that is very unique to the Jewish people. And we're going to see a new kind of leadership, feminine leadership, that will bring new ideas with a different mindset Now, it's not going to be in a matter of decades. It's going to take a century or a couple centuries. But the females in Jewish history will have to show and prove that they are bringing to the table new ideas that have the potential to solve a lot of challenges. And part of them I was just mentioning in this lecture. So I believe that we are moving towards it. I'm very optimistic to the future of the Jewish people worldwide and in Israel, and it remains to see if we will succeed to do it without a lot of negative aspects, or because all those kind of processes in history always have tendency to bring some upheaval in the making. But I believe very much that we have reached a stage in history that we were thinking about it, we were dreaming about it for millennia. And we are doing it, at least up to now, we did it very well, compared to, or of course, to the consequences. I believe very much in our children, because our children are really a new generation that is totally raised up to be very free. It's not like my generation. I was not born in Israel. I was raised in a transition time between epochs. Now, in order really to bring new ideas, you have to be totally free from the constraints of the past. And then, of course, link your new ideas to the past and push forward your society. Now, humanity have done it already many, many times. Jews have done it already a few times. And I believe that it's a time in which we need to understand the vector that is happening. And we need to take an active role in developing that vector, and not just looking at it from a side, or not realizing that something really huge is happening, and we are just anchoring ourselves in our understanding of the purpose of the past, or the mission of the past. For example, I'm just I'm having a hard time understanding why a lot of Zionist movements are still holding the idea of Zionism like it's the ultimate idea. No, we need to renew, we need to revisit those ideas every century at least. And we don't have to be afraid. We have to bring to the table people that were, in minorities in the way of thinking. We need to bring new perspectives. We don't have to be afraid from anything. We have to go wild. We have to really be very creative in order to continue the development and the journey in our history. So I will rest my case here. You can write down my website. You'll be able to see a lot of materials over there. You'll be able to see some of those of other lectures in my YouTube channel. That I have a blog over there. Just list yourself over that blog, and you might send me emails and questions through my website. I'll be able, as much as I can, to answer if I have anything to add. So let me go to the chat. Let's first.
Just wanted, Professor. We just started so fast, and I didn't have the opportunity to introduce you to the group. So I'll just say in one sentence that Professor David Pasig is a futurist, lecturer, consultant, and best-selling author who specializes in technological, social, and educational futures. I also upload to the drive his bio, so you can read later on, his website, and an article. So on your free time, please read it. And yes, time for questions. Aviel?
All right, I see some questions in the chat. Let me start. Well, world population is going to go through that collapsing stage, mainly because of fertility rate. Fertility rate is dropping behind 2.1 kids for each female. In Israel, it's constantly growing. In many places worldwide, for example, I'll just give you an example. China is now 1.4 billion people. By the end of the 21st century, they will go back to 700. They will lose half of their population because of one-child policy, because of the fertility rate that is probably something like 1.2, 1.3 kids for each female. In Israel, 20 years ago, we used to be 2.5 kids for each female. Now we are already 3.1 kids for each female. So, fertility rate is an amazing phenomenon. The reason is because we are recovering from the 20th century and the Holocaust. Okay, and of course, you add to it immigration, and you get what you get over there. Okay, if in order to have the book, if you send me an email with your address, then I'll send you a link from which to download the book, or I can just send you the book as a soft cover. If you wish to buy it in Amazon, it's over there, but in Amazon it's only hardcover. It costs a lot of money. All right, I have to admit that what struck me the most is the number of non-Jews in Israel. Why? Muslims, Arab will almost be as numerous as Jews in Israel? Who told that? Who told you that? I didn't say that. It's exactly the opposite. The Muslims in Israel are shrinking. The number is shrinking. It's not that they're going to be the same as Jews in Israel. All right. I agree. What I've been hearing is regarding the growth of the Israeli citizens and even the growth of the Palestinians. No, that's not true. I didn't say that. Exactly the contrary. We know that the growth of the population in, for example, in the West Bank is shrinking. Okay, their fertility rate, by the way, is 2.5. It's exactly like Jordan. And the Israelis are 3.1. Okay, and that's a phenomenon, as I told you, is because of course the ratio between genders. And because of females are getting more educated, they are generally speaking, they are much more urbanized. That's a trend that has happened all over the world, and it's happening already also in the Middle East Muslim world or nations. And the most expensive city, Tel Aviv, yeah, of course. Well, that's another issue we need to take care of, and the reason that it's so expensive now in Israel is because very few people, 30, 40 years, thought that will be 10 million people by 2020 and did not understand that they need to build a lot. That's part of not thinking ahead, 30 and 40 years ahead. The Israelis about 30, 40 years used to think year by year and at best 5 years ahead. And I'm working hard in Israel to push the futures thinking as much as possible, not a decade ahead, but think about the future a century ahead. And since we didn't do it 30, 40 years ago, the outcome is that it's so expensive now to buy real estate in Israel. You're interested in the book. Okay, the world society in this growing try to decentralize Jewish from another side with this growing. I didn't understand. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. I see. Somebody's already David Fiordanetini, other conference. All right. Do you think the size of Haredi society in Israel become too large to maintain? Very good question. I'll finish with that question. Now, if I am to learn from the past, I will say the following. There were from the beginning, there were a lot of sects, a lot of movements within the Jewish people. Okay? Most of those sects within the Jewish people were actually reflected from other things that were happening outside of the Jewish people. Okay? I'll give you an example. Okay? The Haredi movement is a reaction to other things that happened outside the Jewish people. Because of the Tsar asked the Jews, forced the Jews to be concentrated on certain places, then Haredim started to develop. There were no Haredim 300-400 years ago. Zionism, as a movement within Judaism, was a reaction, a reflection of another trend that was happening outside the Jewish world, which is what we call nationalism. Okay, so all those movements, or of course the modern Jews, modern Zionist Jews, or modern Zionist movement, also a reaction to other things that were happening. In a century from now, we're not going to have Haredim. We're not going to have religious Zionists. We're not going to have different, sects that used to be within the Zionist movement. Everything is changing. How it is changing, it's not an easy thing to understand. But one thing is clear to me. The Haredim of today will not be around a century from now. All those people that are, saying that there will be just Haredim in the future, they really don't understand how things are developing. Nowadays already, within the Haredi movement, there are at least 20 to 30% that are not religious. But they look like Haredim because of many other reasons. Think about the Haredim of a century ago. Most of the Zionists that are secular now in Israel, their parents or their grandparents were Haredim. So things are constantly changing. The only thing I would like you to remember is that never do linear extrapolation in history. Things are going up and down constantly. Okay, so I don't believe that Israel is going to be Haredim. I don't believe Israel is going to be totally secular. We are developing a new narrative, a new kind of Judaism in the 21st century. And of course, the center of that epoch is going to be in Israel, which is fascinating after 2,600 years. Now, most of the Jews will be part of that effort. And there will be, always Jews all over the world, like it used to be forever. But the center of Judaism is moving after 2,600 years back to Israel. And diaspora is going to be the minority of Jews. At best, maybe 4 million Jews out of 24 million Jews worldwide by the end of the 21st century. That's the ratio. 20 million Jews in Israel, another 4 million Jews minorities, and 4 million Jews scattered all over the world, depending on Israel. Exactly the opposite of what happened, of what used to be a century ago, or at least 80 years ago. So this is at least how I see things. Now, if you want to see the methodologies, how did we, how exactly we were able to analyze those kind of things, the book really enlarges a lot of things. Otherwise, just send me any questions in email. you have my email in my website. My website is passig.com, passig with double S. Be careful, don't write passig with one S, otherwise we'll be directed to something I don't want you to even know it exists. Anyway, thank you so much, and I hope I have contributed something to you. And take it into account that you will be the ones to take, Judaism to its next phase, whether you like it or not. Our generation is bit by bit diminishing, and you will be the one to take the realm. And if you will have a clear purpose, a clear mission in your hand, it will be much easier than just taking care of new kids, taking care of elders, taking care of a little bit donations. That's really small. You can take a much greater mission in history that will fulfill you, and that will be part of something bigger that is happening in Jewish history. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Thanks for your attention, and I hope I'll be able to see you face to face. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor.
Thank you. Continue. Bye.